They thought she was just another old woman. What they didn't know. She owned the room. At a lavish wedding full of pride and privilege, a quiet black woman in simple clothes was ignored, insulted, and pushed to the side. But just minutes later, the entire room stood up. Those who mocked her bowed in silence. And the woman they dismissed became a symbol of dignity. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a reckoning. Stay until the end to discover who she truly is and why this moment changed everything. They thought she was the help. When the petite elderly woman stepped out of the dusty pickup truck, wearing plain flats and a faded floral dress, several guests looked away, some even chuckled. It was the wedding of Logan Whitaker, heir to the Whitaker Holdings fortune, and Isabella Green, daughter of a political dynasty. The event was nothing short of a royal affair held at a private vineyard in Napa Valley, with imported orchids, live jazz, and a guest list that read like a Forbes feature. Everyone who was anyone was there. But when Clara James arrived, no entourage, no diamonds, no designer dress, no one stood to greet her. In fact, the valet hesitated before even opening her door. A server walking past whispered, "Did someone's maid get lost?" But Clara didn't flinch. Her back was straight, her eyes soft but sharp, and her hands held nothing but a small gift wrapped in newspaper. No one knew the truth yet. No one knew that the woman they were ignoring was about to shift the axis of this perfectly orchestrated day. Because Clara James wasn't just another guest. She was the storm in silence, and before the sun set behind the vines, the entire Whitaker dynasty would regret ever underestimating her. Clara walked with quiet grace, the gravel crunching softly under her worn shoes. Logan, the groom, spotted her from across the courtyard. His eyes lit up, just for a second, a flicker of recognition and warmth, but he didn't move. Not with Isabella's mother, Margaret Green, standing at his side, clutching her wine glass like a scepter. Margaret turned to her daughter with a raised brow. "Who invited that woman?" she said, not bothering to lower her voice. I think she's from the groom's side," Isabella replied hesitantly, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes following Clara's every step. Clara made her way through the guests, offering polite nods and gentle smiles. But the air grew colder the farther she walked. Conversations quieted as she passed, then picked up again in hushed tones once she moved beyond earshot. A waiter sidestepped her entirely, carrying a tray of champagne flutes that sparkled in the golden sun. Not a single glass was offered. At one table, a woman in pearls whispered, "Is she the cleaning lady from their ranch?" Another laughed too loudly, "Well, she missed the memo on dress code." But Clara didn't react. She had seen worse. Far worse. She took a seat near the back, at a table conveniently left empty. Her gift, still wrapped in newspaper, sat quietly before her. Her fingers, though aged and weathered, traced the folded paper with care. A breeze lifted the ends of her dress, and a child no older than 7 ran past and waved. Clara smiled warmly and waved back. But from the center of the vineyard, Margaret Green was watching, one eye on Clara, the other scanning the crowd, as if ensuring no one of status would be seen engaging with her. And as Clara lifted a cup of water to her lips, she heard it. Clear as day. "She doesn't belong here," Margaret said sharply to her husband, her words like vinegar. Clara paused, eyes forward, still smiling. Not because she hadn't heard. But because she already knew. They had no idea who she was. As the sun dipped lower over the vineyard, casting golden light on champagne glasses and silk gowns, the subtle cruelty continued. Clara reached for a small canopy from a passing tray. The server hesitated, then tilted the tray slightly away. She didn't push. She simply pulled her hand back with quiet grace. From across the lawn, Isabella's younger cousin, a teenage boy in a too-tight tuxedo, laughed under his breath. "She's probably here to clean up after us." Clara's hands rested gently on the wrapped gift before her. She said nothing, but her silence wasn't weakness. It was history. It was legacy. It was patience forged in fires these people couldn't imagine. At the sweetheart table, Logan clenched his jaw, watching the scene unfold. He knew this wasn't right. He knew who Clara really was. But with Margaret Green at his shoulder and a sea of status-hungry guests watching, he froze. Clara caught his eye. She gave him a soft nod almost imperceptible as if to say, "Not yet." Meanwhile, at the center of attention, Margaret swirled her wine like a practiced queen, speaking in measured tones to her friends. "Well, you have to admit," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Logan's done well for himself, considering where he comes from." The laughter was soft but cruel. Clara heard it. She always heard it. But instead of scowling or retreating, she poured herself a glass of water, held it calmly between her fingers, and looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving slowly like time was waiting for something. And deep in her heart, Clara James knew. That moment was coming. Clara had barely taken 2 steps onto the marble terrace before Margaret Green intercepted her. Like a hawk spotting an unwelcome shadow on an otherwise pristine lawn, she glided forward all pearls, posture, and perfectly practiced poise. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice as brittle as crystal under strain. She didn't smile. Clara stopped, polite but firm. "Yes?" Margaret's eyes swept down Clara's figure, taking in the modest dress, the scuffed shoes, the hands holding a gift wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Her expression didn't change, but her nose seemed to tilt upward almost reflexively. "I believe staff are supposed to enter through the side service gate," Margaret said. "You must have been misdirected." A hush fell around them. Nearby guests slowed their steps, pretending not to listen while doing exactly that. Clara met her gaze calmly. "I'm not part of the staff, Ms. Green." Margaret blinked once. "Oh," she said with mock surprise, her tone laced with sugar and venom. "Well. That's unfortunate. For the aesthetic." Clara didn't flinch. Margaret continued, her voice quieter now, but no less sharp. "You see, this isn't the type of gathering where," she gestured vaguely toward Clara's attire, "every guest gets to bring their own flavor." Clara smiled. It wasn't fake. It was the kind of smile born from surviving decades of this same performance. "I suppose not every gathering is meant to be memorable," Clara said evenly. "But sometimes, they are anyway." Margaret stared, briefly rattled. Clara inclined her head respectfully and walked past slow, steady, unbothered. Behind her, Margaret stood frozen. Several guests looked away, pretending to check their glasses. Others whispered behind manicured hands. The queen of the vineyard had just been disarmed. And she didn't even know how. At a table draped in imported linen, Gregory Whittaker Logan's father leaned back in his chair, surrounded by old money friends with cigars in their breast pockets and polished smiles. A former oil executive turned vineyard magnate, he was a man used to being heard. "I still say we're clinging to too many outdated traditions," Gregory said, sipping his scotch with theatrical flair. "Weddings should evolve. All this family history talk, sentimentality has no place in serious business." He chuckled, and the others followed not because it was funny, but because they knew to laugh when Gregory Whittaker spoke. Not far away, Clara sat still. She had once heard those same words in boardrooms, behind closed doors, in grant meetings where lives were decided with the stroke of a pen. She knew this kind of man. They wore power like perfume, heavy and overdone. But Clara didn't engage. She simply reached into her small clutch and pulled out a folded photograph worn at the edges, colors faded. She looked at it with a softness only years could give, her thumb brushing over a younger version of Logan, maybe 7 or 8, sitting beside her on the steps of an old farmhouse. He was smiling wide, unguarded, holding a book far too thick for his age. Gregory's laughter reached her again. Clara didn't even blink. She had already decided, tonight would not be about their arrogance. It would be about what they never saw coming. "Excuse me, ma'am," a young server said, voice tight with discomfort. "This table is being reserved for special guests later. We may need you to relocate." Clara looked up slowly, folding the photo and placing it gently back in her clutch. The seat she occupied had been empty for nearly an hour, untouched, unnoticed, and now, suddenly, it mattered. "Oh," she said calmly. "I see." The server shifted uncomfortably. Behind him, a woman in a sequin dress, one of Margaret's close friends, whispered, not so subtly, "Finally. Someone's clearing that eyesore." Clara stood, not out of shame, but with deliberate poise. She picked up her small gift, nodded politely, and stepped aside as the server wiped the table down like she had left a mess. No one offered her another seat. No one looked her in the eye. As Clara walked to the far edge of the vineyard, the sound of her heels against the stone path felt louder than any insult. Guests turned just enough to watch, not to help, only to confirm she was leaving. Margaret watched the scene unfold from her spot near the center of attention, sipping her wine with thinly veiled satisfaction. She should be grateful she was even invited, she muttered. At the edge of the garden, Clara found an empty bench near a small olive tree. From here, she could still see Logan, could still hear the music, the clinking of glasses, the laughter. But they couldn't see her anymore. And that, to them, was ideal. What they didn't realize was that this moment, this humiliation, was their last chance to change the way they'd remember her. Because soon, she would no longer be invisible. Back near the main reception, the violins quieted, and the clink of silverware paused as the event coordinator stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, voice clear and amplified through the sound system, "please turn your attention to the center stage. We are honored to welcome a very distinguished guest this evening, a figure whose impact on business, education, and social progress has touched countless lives." A hush fell over the vineyard. Guests straightened in their chairs. Some adjusted their suits, others dabbed their lipstick. Margaret's eyes sparkled. She was certain the guest of honor was someone from her circle. Someone she could name-drop later. Then came the moment. The crowd began to part, like a tide pulling away from shore, as a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit walked down the stone path toward the stage. His presence was quiet but commanding, a kind of effortless authority that didn't need a microphone. He didn't go to the stage. Instead, he turned directly toward the olive tree. Toward Clara James. The silence grew deeper, the kind that pressed against eardrums. Guests turned their heads in confusion. The man stopped in front of her, bowed slightly, and said, "Ms. James. It's an honor, truly." Clara smiled up at him. "Hello, Thomas. It's been a while." Gasps broke out across the crowd. Because that was Thomas Ellington. Billionaire investor. Board chairman of 3 Fortune 100 companies. Philanthropist whose face had graced the cover of Time twice. And he had just bowed to her. The crowd collectively held its breath as Thomas turned toward the stage, but not before offering Clara his arm. "May I?" he asked. Clara rose slowly, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow with timeless elegance. Together, they walked, not rushed, but with purpose, down the aisle of stunned guests. Every step felt like thunder. The air changed. The whispers began. "That's Clara James? The Clara James?" As they reached the stage, Thomas raised his hand to quiet the murmurs. "Before we begin," he said, his voice firm but warm, "I'd like to acknowledge someone without whom none of my work, none of my success would exist." He turned to Clara. "This woman," he said, "mentored me when no one else would. She believed in my vision when I had no capital, no reputation, and no voice." Gasps rippled across the courtyard. "She taught me how to negotiate, how to build, and most importantly, how to lead with integrity. You all know me as Thomas Ellington, but I would be nothing without Miss Clara James." The silence was absolute. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then rising like a wave breaking over the vineyard. But the Montgomerys, the Greens, the so-called elite? They sat frozen. Because in that moment, the woman they had treated like invisible dust had just been revealed as the foundation beneath an empire. The applause had not yet faded when Clara gently stepped toward the microphone. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to perform. She simply spoke and the entire vineyard listened. "Good evening," Clara began, her tone steady, rich with quiet command. "I wasn't supposed to speak tonight. Truth be told, I wasn't sure I'd stay long enough to even witness this moment." A murmur rolled through the audience. "I've been overlooked before. Ignored. Judged. Sometimes by strangers. Sometimes, by family." Eyes darted toward the Montgomerys and Greens. "But I stayed," she continued, "because I wanted to see what kind of future this marriage might create." She looked at Logan, then at Isabella. "I watched, I listened, and I waited." She paused. Waited to see if anyone would stand up. If anyone would speak. If anyone would say, "This isn't right." Now the silence was thick, ashamed, almost tangible. Clara glanced down, then smiled faintly. But perhaps this was necessary. Because tonight, masks fell. True character revealed itself. And in this very public space, we all saw the cost of silence. Then she turned back to Thomas. "Thank you for reminding me that being invisible doesn't mean being insignificant." Thomas bowed his head once more. And behind him, scattered across the vineyard, guests who had once looked through her now looked at her. Not with pity, but with reverence. At a table not far from the stage, Margaret Green sat stiffly, her spine straight but her confidence shattered. The color had drained from her face, and the wine glass she held trembled ever so slightly in her hand. Beside her, Richard Montgomery, ever the image of elite composure, stared forward, unblinking. For a man who had always prided himself on being the most powerful presence in any room, tonight he looked like a ghost of himself. They hadn't just dismissed a woman. They had dismissed a legend. And worse, they had done it publicly. Guests they once flaunted relationships with were now shifting in their chairs, stealing glances, whispering. Some shook their heads in quiet judgment. Others simply looked away, unsure how to process the shift in hierarchy that had just occurred. Clara James hadn't demanded retribution. She hadn't raised her voice. She had merely existed in full truth, and that had been enough to dismantle their illusion of superiority. Thomas remained at her side, his posture reverent. A man who had commanded billions stood still like a student in the presence of a teacher. And the rest of the world simply watched. Isabella, standing a few feet from the stage, had tears in her eyes. Not for shame alone, but for what had been lost. An opportunity to stand with Clara, to stand up sooner. The weight of regret pressed hard on her chest. And Logan? He looked at his grandmother as if seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. Margaret was the first to recover, or at least, pretend to. She stood, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and approached the stage with a wine glass still in hand. The crowd, now fully aware, watched her every step. "Oh, Ms. James," she said, voice dripping with artificial warmth, "if only we had known, truly, we had no idea. You really should have said something earlier." Clara turned to her, calm as ever. "There was nothing to say," she replied smoothly. "A person's worth isn't determined by what they announce, it's revealed by how others treat them, especially when they think no one's watching." Margaret's smile faltered, the edges trembling. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, no words forming. Richard, ever the strategist, stood next, extending a hand with a rehearsed grin. "Well, Ms. James," he said, "it's truly an honor. Perhaps we can sit down sometime and—" Clara looked at his hand. Then, without a word, she turned away, not with anger, but with the quiet finality of someone who owed them nothing. That turn, that single motion was louder than any outburst. And it echoed across the vineyard like a gavel striking truth. The mighty had not just fallen. They had been dismissed. From the side of the stage, Michael stepped forward. His shoulders were squared, his voice steady, but beneath that calm lay a storm of pride, rage, and resolve. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight," he began, glancing at Clara, "but I think silence has done enough damage." He turned to face the crowd and especially the Montgomerys and Greens. "You all spent the evening concerned with appearances, with pedigree, with power. And in doing so, you looked down on the most extraordinary person here." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "You treated my grandmother like she didn't belong. Like she wasn't good enough. But the truth is she's done more, built more, and given more than most people in this room combined." There was no applause. Only the kind of silence that demands reflection. Michael inhaled, then continued, this time softer. "She didn't need to prove herself tonight. She's been proving herself her entire life." He looked directly at Isabella's parents. "And now, maybe it's your turn, to start." Olivia stood frozen. For the first time in her life, she didn't know where to stand, not physically, but morally. Her eyes darted between her parents, faces rigid with humiliation, and Michael, whose calm strength now radiated like something ancient, inherited. The truth wasn't whispered anymore. It was blaring. And she had been silent for too long. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to Michael, barely audible, her voice breaking. "I should have said something. I should have stopped them." Michael turned to her slowly, his gaze unreadable. Then, gently, he reached for her hand. "It's not your burden to carry, Olivia," he said. "But what matters now, is what happens next." Tears welled in her eyes. She gripped his hand tightly. "Then I promise," she said, louder now, steady, "our marriage, our future will never be built on ignorance or pride. I won't let what I saw tonight define who we become." From the edge of the crowd, Clara smiled. Softly. Silently. Like a seed had just been planted. Richard, clinging to the last threads of his pride, stepped forward again. This time, his smile was brittle, stretched across a face drained of color. He extended his hand once more. "Well, Ms. James," he began, "it's truly an honor. Perhaps we can sit down sometime, discuss opportunities." Clara turned to him slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't glare. She didn't even flinch. Her eyes simply met his steady, knowing, immovable. And then, without a word, she turned away. No dramatics. No outrage. Just silence. But it was the kind of silence that hits like thunder, the kind that says, "You no longer have access to me." It was louder than rejection. More final than insult. Richard's hand dropped. So did his mask. And for the first time in decades, he looked small. Clara didn't rush. She walked slowly, not with weariness, but with intention, back to her table at the edge of the vineyard. The same table they'd tried to move her from. The one they had deemed unworthy. Now, it stood like a quiet throne. She sat down gracefully. Picked up her fork. And resumed eating her dessert. Around her, the world continued in fractured motion. Conversations resumed in awkward murmurs. A violinist plucked tentative notes. Waiters floated nervously past, suddenly unsure of protocol. But Clara? She savored a bite of lemon tart as if it were the most ordinary moment in the world. Because for her, it was. She didn't gloat. She didn't gawk. She just existed fully, freely, unapologetically. And that was the final lesson. True class isn't loud. It's unshakable. The vineyard still glowed under the amber wash of evening, but something had shifted. It wasn't the music. It wasn't the lighting. It was where people were looking. No longer at the stage. No longer at the bride. Not even at the billionaire. They were looking at Clara James. One by one, the most powerful people in the room, judges, CEOs, elected officials, began to drift in her direction. Not with pity. Not out of guilt. But with awe. Because in a single night, without raising her voice, without lifting a finger, Clara had dismantled an entire social illusion. Margaret and Richard remained seated, their once commanding presence reduced to silent discomfort. The charm they once wielded so effortlessly had cracked, the polite smiles now masked, slipping under the weight of their own exposed arrogance. Clara, meanwhile, continued sipping tea as the world recalibrated around her. From the crowd, a young woman approached, nervously. "Ms. James," she said, her voice soft, "I just wanted to say, thank you. For showing us what strength really looks like." Clara looked up, smiled gently, and replied, "My dear, strength isn't what you show the world. It's what you choose not to let break you." As the evening drew to a close, the music swelled one final time, a soft instrumental playing beneath the murmurs of reflection. Clara stood from her seat, gathering her shawl. No spotlight followed her. No announcement heralded her departure. But every eye followed her. She didn't stop for more handshakes. She didn't bask in praise. She simply walked with the same grace she had arrived with, past rows of guests who now stood in silence. Margaret watched her leave, unable to lift her gaze. Richard sat frozen, his hand still resting on a napkin he no longer needed. Michael and Olivia followed her with their eyes, their hands clasped tightly, a new promise between them. And in her quiet exit, Clara James did what no toast or speech ever could. She shifted hearts. Changed the room. And made them remember. Not for her wealth. Not for her status. But for her dignity. Because in the end, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you command by simply living in truth. In a world obsessed with appearances, status, and surface-level prestige, Clara James reminded us of something profoundly human, that true worth is not worn, it is lived. She walked into a room where no one saw her, and by the end of the night, she had become the only person anyone remembered. Her story teaches us that dignity doesn't need a spotlight. It stands tall even in silence, even when uninvited and unwanted. Strength isn't loud. It's in choosing grace over retaliation, stillness over spectacle, and truth over performance. You don't have to announce your value. Those who matter, the ones with wisdom, humility, and heart, will see it, even if it takes the whole world failing to. Clara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reminded us that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you command simply by living your truth with integrity, even when no one's watching. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who rewrites the legacy of everyone in it. Use this moment to reflect. When you walk into a room, are you trying to be seen? Or are you trying to stand for something that matters?